This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday Twilight Show here on Teachers Talk Radio. I'm your host, Michelle, and tonight I will be taking you all on a journey back in time to explore the connections that education today might still have with that of our Victorian colleagues. Have we retained the core of their philosophies? Or are they no longer relevant? Stay tuned.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello again, everyone. Thank you so much for those of you who've joined. Welcome to the show, the Twilight Show, and I'm hoping that tonight will be another informative and insightful discussion. So tonight, as I said in the introduction, I'm just going to take you down memory lane a little bit. Not memory lane, because this is Victorian times. So I'm taking you back in the past and just to explore what education was like then and how it has helped to shape education today. So, having been in the classroom for a number of years now, I'm becoming increasingly reflective on current customs and practices that shape the 21st century education landscape, because clearly there has to be an origin. And so, we're thinking about the teaching and learning infrastructure, behavior for learning expectations, relationships with stakeholders like parents, the community, our approach to monitoring and inspections. And if you think about it, they all seem to have remnants from the Victorian era. So in tonight's show, I would like to explore what remains or have been altered somewhat, because a lot of it has been altered for obvious reasons. We'll look at what's still relevant and what needs to be reconsidered. Because when you think about it, sometimes as adults, we ourselves cannot justify some of the rules that we impose on our children. And they will ask you, but why are we doing this? And why do I need to tie my hair back? And why do I need to tuck my shirt in? As my fellow colleagues can tell you. But we do it because sometimes these are the things we learned ourselves in school. These are the things that our principals expected of us. And then when we join various schools, those are the rules we're expected to facilitate or to encourage amongst our students or to get them to follow as well. And of course, when we enter teacher training programs, those values are further entrenched through pedagogy. So I'm not suggesting at all that we do away with school rules. We need them for our own sanity. We need them for some structure and some order. But the question tonight is, are they all necessary? So that's what we're going to explore. For those of you already online, please remember to download the Podbean app so you can tune in, share your own thoughts, your own opinions as well. And let me hear what you think. Are we still very Victorian in our ways, in our expectations, or have we shifted away massively? So let's talk about it. So in order to really establish where we're at today and what values we still uphold, I think it's important for us to have an overview of education in Victorian England and what it was like. So education, first of all, was not mandatory at the beginning of the Victorian era, but became increasingly structured. And based on my research, these are some of the possible reasons, which I'm sure you would not be surprised about. We had the Industrial Revolution and economic needs. So with the rise of factories and industries, that created a demand for literate and numerate workers, because clearly the owners of these factories needed people who could read instructions, write records, and perform basic calculations. So there was a demand. And even today in our society, education responds to the demands of our society. And what the workforce requires is technically what schools should be providing and churning out those children who will become adults and will fill those spaces. And so in Victorian times, the Industrial Revolution highlighted that particular need. Education then became a tool for social mobility and economic progress. And for a lot of the Victorians at the time, especially the poorer Victorians, because the class system wasn't as distinct, we didn't have maybe a strict middle class, it was rich or poor. And so education was a way for the people in the working class, the poorer class, to move up the social ladder. Now, today, education is still seen as the way out and the way to climb the social ladder. However, there are more creative ways of doing so these days. And with the growth of social media, that has really opened up more opportunities for people to move up socially. Then they also had social reforms and changing attitudes. So there was an increased awareness of child welfare, which led to a push for education as a way to improve lives. So we know that it was during this time we had children being used as chimney sweeps. Some of them turned to begging, some of them resorted to stealing. So with social reform, there was an awareness of child welfare and that those attitudes and practices needed to change. So we had reformers like Lord Shaftesbury, who was one of the most effective social and industrial reformers in the 19th century, who really pushed for those changes. And also, of course, the very famous Charles Dickens, through his writing, through his literature, he promoted that as well and highlighted the struggles of the poor, and especially poor children. And I'm sure you can all name a Charles Dickens text that highlights some of those issues and concerns. So education was therefore seen as a means to reduce child labor and poverty, because we know that in the Victorian times, children were sent out to work so that they could contribute to the household income. There were also government interventions and legislations. So before the 19th century, education was mainly run by churches and charities. And that led to inconsistency, and funding was also minimal. So they had poor facilities and class sizes of up to 100. Now, today we complain if our class sizes go beyond 25. Could you imagine? Or Victorian counterparts with up to 100 students. So for me, the maximum number of students I've ever taught in any one setting was 60. And I did that twice actually. Once in the early days back in Jamaica when I was doing my teacher training, we had a class of about 60 students. And I had to resort to some strict Victorian rules to make sure that there was order and discipline. And I'll talk about some of those rules later on in the show. But class sizes were huge. And it's important to bear in mind also that the wealthy children were taught by governesses, and they were taught Latin and all the sophisticated subjects. The poor children were taught the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic. Okay, so they weren't exposed to the classics and classical studies. So those were some of the things that existed before the reform. And then the government introduced laws to standardize schooling. And a lot of that we see today that's been built upon today to create what we have in the 21st century. We had Factory Acts in 1833, 1844, and 1847, which limited child labor and encouraged schooling. We had the Forced to Education Act, really popular one, that was introduced in 1870, which established state-funded elementary schools. And then the Education Act of 1880 made school attendance compulsory for children aged 5 to 10. Now, that was important because parents would still be keeping their children at home to take care of daily chores and to help them work, as I said earlier, to bring in the income. And by 1891, the Free Education Act was introduced, and that made elementary education free for all children. So you could see the gradual development. Now, one thing with the curriculum, it promoted nationalism and empire building. And if you can imagine the times in which this occurred, you can see the relevance of that. So the British Empire needed educated citizens to work in administration, trade, and governance. Of course, they needed these people to go to the Commonwealth, to the colonized regions, and to spread nationalism, that's British nationalism, and to train people to read and write as well, to make them literate and numerate, and to make sure that they're very knowledgeable about the British Empire and the British history as well. So that was one of the reasons as well. So schools promoted British history, geography, and patriotism. Then we had the growth of educational institutions and training for teachers. So if you could imagine, now that education is being formalized, clearly there was a demand for teachers. So teacher training establishments were opened, teacher training colleges, and then the government set standards for curriculum, discipline, and examinations. So we could see how gradually things were becoming a little bit more structured and regularized in the Victorian times. It's important to note that religion was promoted at the time. So there was a lot of religious and moral influence. Remember, the church had a lot to do with the establishment of schools initially. So they had a lot of stake in the evolution of education at the time. The Church of England, in particular, and other religious groups promoted education to teach Christian values and discipline. And then, of course, with that, schools emphasized moral instruction, obedience, and respect for authority. And today, we still have remnants of that. We still have some church schools, whether Catholic or Anglican or Church of England, but they still exist. They're operating on different levels today because it's all regularized and it's not inconsistent as it was then, but they still exist. In Jamaica, where I did my high school years, there are many church schools. I went to a Catholic school, for instance, and then I taught in an Anglican school. So those are remnants, I think, of the Victorian era. Now we see a shift away from that with academies being formed. And I think at one point we had free schools being created. So those are some of the things that influenced the need for education in the Victorian times and just how it became regularized and developed and more structured. So I'm going to take another short break. Do remember to download the Podbean app so that you can have a chat with me as well. Let me know your thoughts, share your comments, or ask a question, and I'll try my very best to answer them. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. I'm going to share a little bit more about the Victorian times, but when we come back, I will be looking at some of the key values that were created at that time and some of the key values and methods that were used in Victorian schooling. Do stay tuned.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Yes, so there you go, John Catt. They've got a very impressive catalogue. Do check them out. So just before that short break, I was just talking about some of the historical context behind Victorian education and how it evolved over the years. So I'm going to start the discussion, and I'm going to start with key values and methods used in Victorian era schooling. Some of these you all know about, so I'm sure you'll be chuckling a little bit along with me as we remind ourselves of these things. And the first thing I'm looking at is discipline and obedience. Schools enforced strict rules to instill obedience and respect for authority. There were no shades of grey. Victorian schools were known for this: strict discipline and harsh punishments. And they believed that these instilled obedience, respect, and moral character. Now, this was successful for them. And if we look at it from more 21st century perspectives, we'll be like, that was barbaric. But teachers were regarded as very strict authority figures, and students were expected to follow rigid rules with little room for questioning or creativity. So today, the alarm bells are going off because today we encourage questioning, we encourage critical thinking, we encourage creativity in the classroom. We talk about engagement, and it's all about pupil engagement. Back then, they had no choice. They had to engage, whether they were learning or not. They had to show that they were engaging by learning in absolute silence. Another thing that was prevalent was corporal punishment, which, of course, we do not entertain at all today. But that was widely used to maintain discipline. Corporal punishment in the form of caning, and that was the most common form of punishment, where children were hit on the hand, the legs, the bottom with a cane for misbehavior or poor performance. So clearly, an outdated practice and one that should not have been used in the first place, because we really shouldn't resort to violence to try to instill discipline. But there were also ruler slaps. So it wasn't just straight for the cane. There were ruler slaps for minor infractions, such as talking in class. Today, we have a different structure, don't we? Students talk, we take them through the process of a warning, and then you go through your behavior policy and you take it to wherever if the behavior continues. But then they would have a ruler slap. So that was a minor punishment in their eyes. And of course, they had the air and the hair pulling, which I'm sure if you're probably from the Gen X generation, you'd probably be aware of this, not necessarily from teachers, but from the home. A quick and humiliating punishment for inattentiveness or misbehavior. So they would do it there and then. I mean, it would probably get a giggle out of the other children who would then be pulled back in line with a slap. So there was absolutely no way out. Very strict discipline. Another thing that was practiced then was public humiliation and the use of the dunce cap. And I think in one of my previous shows, I talked about this because I saw that in a school I taught at back in the day, where somebody actually used that when a student was not doing as she was told or following the instructions or making progress. But it was not entertained, I must add. It was frowned upon by all of us. So a child who struggled academically might be forced to wear a tall, pointed hat labeled dunce and stand in the corner as a warning to others. And if you watch some older films, you'd probably see examples of this. Now, imagine how humiliating that must have been and soul destroying for that child to be walking around all day. And even if they're no longer wearing the dunce cap, it's almost etched on them. It's like a Jane Eyre type of thing, where other students will be seeing them and thinking, uh-oh, that one is of low intelligence. That one is not smart enough. He or she is not clever. And to walk around with that label, even if it's not visible anymore, must have been really hard for these children. Sometimes they were asked to stand in the corner. So misbehaving students would be made to stand in the corner for extended periods, sometimes on one leg. And if any of my classmates from primary school is listening to this, then you remember in primary school we had a room called the dark room. I've never been to the dark room. I tried my best not to ever enter the dark room, but we were always curious about it. And the students who were constantly visiting or frequenting the dark room because of misbehavior, we would ask them, what is it like? What's happening in the dark room? And they would tell us that they would have to kneel for extended periods in the dark room because apparently that's where you go to develop your character. So that was a remnant of the Victorian times, not practiced today, I'm sure, because honestly, that is definitely child abuse if you think about it. A very popular one, which I think existed well into the 20th century, writing lines. Pupils were required to repeatedly write out phrases such as, I must not talk in class, or I must do my homework, or I must listen to my teacher, or the teacher is authority, you name it. Whatever the misdemeanor was, they would have to write out lines to correct their behavior. How effective that would have been? Not so sure. Now, in my early years of teaching, I've witnessed this where students were given lines. I don't recall doing it myself, but if any of my former students who've been given lines by Ms. Hines, just reach out and remind me. I don't recall doing it myself, but I've seen where other members of staff have given students lines to write as a form of punishment. I remember one colleague actually giving a student a copy of the broadsheet newspaper and asking her to shade in all the O's and all the noughts, just shade them in. And that took that child the entire afternoon as a form of punishment. I don't know, it's yet to be seen how effective that was. But another bit of the remnant from more Victorian colleagues. Now let's talk about some of the rules in the classroom. Students were asked to sit in absolute silence unless they were spoken to and they were given a response. Talking out of turn was severely punished. That would have been a caning immediately or being sent to the headmaster or the headmistress, which I'll talk about later. But they had to learn in absolute silence. In our classrooms today, we do demand silence when we're giving instructions or if they're working independently. However, there is room for discussion. We get students to talk to the person next to them, think, pair, share, and all of that. So it's not as rigid. And if students do talk out of turn, they're usually warned. We obviously don't cane anymore, but they do get a warning. So I think to an extent, don't know if you'll agree with me, you can tell me your own thoughts, but we still kind of demand silence. And we don't cane and we don't hit our students today, but we do give them the eye, don't we? So if students are expected to work in silence and they're not following those instructions, most of us, we don't even need to speak. We just give them the death stare, or we just have that look, or we stop in our tracks and they get it. It's absolute silence. I'm finding that increasingly, the younger students, that doesn't even work of such, because you stare at them and they will make a comment. Miss, are you okay? Are you having a good day, miss? Whereas in the past, I find that students would just get it immediately. So that, in my experience, is changing a little bit. So we just have to keep adjusting to meet the demands of the new generations. Another thing you would have found in the Victorian classroom is the rigid seating arrangements. So desks were arranged in rows and children sat upright with hands folded when they were not writing. So today we've moved away from that a bit and we encourage students to sit in groups or in pairs or whatever. But very rarely will you walk into a classroom today and see the desks in ordered rows. And if that's the case, usually it's because of an assessment. But a more creative style is encouraged these days. I love a horseshoe. So sometimes you'll find I have a middle table, a middle row of desks and chairs joined, and then around it, I've got my desks and chairs. So like a conference style. So I can keep an eye on everybody and it's more collaborative. So the classrooms today, in my opinion, are more collaborative. And this sitting in rigid rows is not so much of an expectation. Now, we do encourage our students and we do tell them to sit upright. I'm sure you'll all agree with me. When they begin to slouch, yep, maybe with a little hand gesture, we go up, sit up, or we tell them outrightly, sit up, pay attention. Hand folding, we don't really encourage that, because I think if we see them folding their hands, we're probably thinking that they're not in the mood to do any work. But we do tell them pens down when they're not supposed to be writing. In our modern day, we say all devices down, please. So it's not just the pens anymore. It's close those devices, pay attention, because if you're not careful, somebody will be sneakingly watching something on their iPads or their laptops that has nothing to do with the learning. So that's the challenge we have today. And it's not them writing and doodling or such. It is being distracted by other things. Now, in the Victorian era as well, there was uniformity in behavior. Students had to follow precise movements, such as standing and sitting on command. Now, to an extent, we have that today, and I've taught in a number of settings, and it is the same everywhere. Well, some things are the same. So, for example, in some schools, students are expected to stand when an adult enters the room, and then they only sit when you tell them, okay, you may be seated. So that still happens in some settings. Increasingly, I think it's changing, and it's not a requirement. Sometimes you walk into a room and the students all stand, you thank them and just quickly. Sometimes I tell them before the third person gets one, no, it's okay. Now, I remember when I was in high school, and if any of my high school classmates are listening, you'll relate to this one. I remember one afternoon, our principal decided to keep us behind after the bell went until we learned how to stand without scraping the chairs on the floor. Now, there was an intercom system, and we would be dismissed via the intercom every afternoon. This particular afternoon, our principal was annoyed that when she said it was time to go, all she could hear were the chairs being scraped on the floor. And she was like, not having it. All of you girls, have a seat. So we would have to sit again. She goes, stand. And then the chairs would scrape and we would have to sit again until she could hear little or nothing at all from the chairs. Now, that was a feat in itself, because imagine a school of maybe over 1,500 girls all standing at the same time. Oh, there will be some sound, there will be some noise. And I remember looking out the window and I could see the cars going around the block of parents who'd come to pick up their children, but they couldn't get them because our principal was adamant that we stand together in silence and we sit together in silence. So that was really Victorian, because in her eyes, we were standing and sitting like ladies. If not, that's why the chairs were being scraped on the floor. So those were some of the expectations. And in terms of uniform as well, they were expected to wear particular uniforms. Girls had to wear knee-length woolen dresses of dark color, with a white apron tied at the back, thick black stockings. Now, as I'm describing this, I'm sure you're probably smiling because you're thinking, what has changed in our uniform? We're still doing the dark colors. The girls' uniform is still expected to be a little bit below the knee. We're still, today we go around and ask the girls to pull the skirts down because the rolling up is a popular trend. I don't think that will ever go out of fashion. I don't know why though, but I know that there are some schools in other parts of the world where, to avoid that, skirts are ankle length, just to avoid, because it would take a lot of bunching to roll that above the knee. So ankle length, and that is it. That's a Victorian trend. Boys, however, were allowed to wear short trousers, ankle boots, or shorts with long socks. They had to wear a jacket, and hear this, a waistcoat. So we're not as extreme, and a jumper underneath, and of course, dark colors. So today, I think maybe for practical reasons, dark colors, lots of schools wear like a white shirt, but with a dark jumper over it. So dark colors were encouraged at the time. Now, students were also punished for various reasons, and one would be incomplete or poor work. So if they didn't complete the work, they would be given extra assignments to do, or if they had poor handwriting, they were given extra work. I know that maybe in the primary schools today, please correct me if I'm wrong, handwriting is still something that's taught. What I do know is by the time the students come to the secondary phase, it is not emphasized as such. However, we do, especially English teachers, we do comment a lot on handwriting. I don't know how much we do to correct it because, quite frankly, some of us, our handwriting is very questionable. So who are we to judge? But we do encourage that, because when they sit their exams, that could be a problem. So let me pause again just to welcome those of you who just joined. Kosha, thank you so much. And I know there's somebody else and a few other people online. Thank you for joining. Tonight we're talking about Victorian education, remnants of it today in the 21st century. So I've covered some of the history of Victorian education. I've looked at some of the punishments, the high expectations, and I'm just talking now about punishments for incomplete or poor work. So please do share your thoughts and your comments or your questions. And Kosha has shared a comment with us. She said her handwriting, I think you're referring to Kosha, is exceptionally questionable. We have a running joke that mine is abstract art. Oh my goodness. Your handwriting is abstract art. We call it doctor's handwriting. Yes. But yet we still insist, don't we, that our students should be mindful of their handwriting. In the Victorian times, they would have been punished for poor handwriting. Now, they were also kept in during break as a form of punishment for poor work. We do that today as well. Students don't do the work or they've misbehaved. We do have break time detentions. And if they failed to meet expectations, they were often kept inside during playtime or lunch breaks. So that's a bit more regulated today. They have to have their lunch, but we can take some of that time as well. And as I mentioned earlier, If the offense is really serious, they were sent to the headmaster or the headmistress for additional punishment, which was often severe caning. Another thing, which hasn't changed really, is parental involvement. We still encourage our parents to be a part of their children's education today. However, back then, they were really used to help support strict discipline. So parents often supported the strict discipline and they completely complied with it. They did not question the authority of the teachers or the principals. Whatever decisions were made regarding their children, they went along with it because they also believed it prepared children for the rigid expectations of Victorian societies. So children didn't really go home and report to their parents, oh, my teacher said this, or my teacher did this, because they knew that they would then be punished at home. And in some cases, as I said, the parents would reinforce this with severe punishment. So it was a deterrent, and then children would not necessarily report that. So for all my colleagues online and all my fellow teachers, I'm sure you've had this experience at least once where something happens at school, and before you even get the chance to report this to the parents or to get in touch, the parents already know. And that's because of technology, obviously. So they will sneakily at break time notify their parents, oh, my teacher did this or this happened today. That was not even, you could not even report to your parents back then. The school would get in touch and the parents would issue their own form of discipline. But things have changed where that is concerned today. How supportive parents are today, that's up for discussion as well. You will find some parents who are extremely supportive, wanting the best for their children, and you have those parents who will not give you a chance for you to explain from your own perspective what happened or to show that you're here to support their children. But they will listen to what the children have to say and cause nothing but issues and conflicts. So it varies, but majority of our parents, I think, are still very supportive. So what were some of the possible impact of these militant approaches? Because clearly there had to be some repercussions. And what some researchers have said is that it created a fear-based learning where many students learned out of fear rather than genuine curiosity. They were just afraid of that leather belt or the cane, whatever material was used for it. They were just afraid of it. And so rather than asking questions or showing that they didn't really understand something or making sure that they did whatever it took to understand something, they would sit there and learn in absolute fear. Now, in my primary school days, and for those of you who are listening, if you're listening from Jamaica, you might be able to relate. I was sharing this with my son last night, actually, that my primary school teacher had a belt that she named her belt, and I've probably spoken about this before. And that belt was a leather belt, like raw cow's hide. And she would keep it on her desk as a reminder. If you step out of line, you will feel the wrath of this belt. And so we would just look at that belt and try our very best to sit in silence and do as we were told and try not to step out of line. So that is something I think that carried over. So there was this sense of conformity over creativity. Questioning authority or thinking independently was absolutely discouraged. Now, today we encourage critical thinking. We ask our students to ask questions. If they don't understand something, we tell them no question is a silly question, so we do encourage it. But they do question our authority today even more than they did in the past when I just started teaching. Oh, wow. Koshi said her teacher also had a belt, her primary school teacher, and she called it Dr. Do Me Good. Dr. Do Me Good. So indirectly, you're being sent a message there that this is not punishment. This is to do you good. This is to make sure that you stay in line and you follow the rules. Absolutely, Koshia. Dr. Do Me Good. Oh my goodness. The things that people got away with, the things teachers got away with back then. And believe it or not, these belts or these straps that they use, they weren't just on the desks for decoration. Coach, you'll agree with me that they did use them. And some students experienced it more than others, but they did use them. So in the Victorian times, students conformed and they couldn't question authority. Today, where students will ask, why? Why am I doing this, miss? Thinking independently was discouraged. You had to learn what was on the curriculum. There was none of this go and research and come back. Well, I think facilities and resources wouldn't lend itself of such to that. But everything was left up to the teacher, and you just did as you were told, learned what you were taught, and regurgitated it later on. Oh my goodness, Kosha said they had assembly beatings. Now that is taking it up a notch. So I guess everybody was gathered, and they were given a fine beating if they misbehaved. Oh my goodness! So the leather belt would be used. Oh wow! So we can see that some of the Victorian styles of discipline really carried over into the 20th century. Oh wow, yeah. And I'm laughing about it, but it is not, it's not humorous. I'm laughing just to think about the fact that people got away with it. Today that's unheard of. But yeah, I remember talking about assembly beating. I haven't experienced that, but I've experienced where the teacher would walk into the classroom and for no obvious reason, she would just say, everybody stand and stretch your hands out. And we're like, what have we done? But we can't even verbalize that. You just have to stand there shaking like a leaf with your hands out, like, ooh, what's going to happen? And the teacher just walked through the classroom and just give everybody a slap on the hand. And we're thinking, right, okay. So what was that for? But I guess that was just a taste of Dr. Do Me Good, I suppose. So that's interesting. So just some remnants from the Victorian times. Now, what happened as a result of that was a high dropout rate. So the harsh conditions led some children to avoid school whenever possible. And I think maybe that's where bunking and truanting started, really. You'd pretend you're going to school, but you're thinking about the punishment and you would just probably stay away. And this was mainly among poorer families. And also those family members would keep the children away just to help them because they relied on the children to help to bring in an income as well. So that would have been one of the reasons why those children would have stayed away as well. And Koshi is also mentioning that they had multiple choice recital after lunch. And I'm going to take another short break. And after that, I'll be talking about rote learning. So yes, Koshi, there we have it anyway, that it still exists to an extent. And dreading making an error that you would get the belt. So I'm going to discuss that after this break, but right on track, Koshia. So please bear that thought in mind. That's what we're going to talk about next. How does it relate to today? Are there any remnants of the Victorian era that we still subscribe to, or maybe watered down a little bit? Is there anything that we need to get rid of completely, or are there some values that we should revisit? Do stay tuned.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Welcome back, everybody. For those of you who've joined, thank you so much. Remember to download the Podbean app so that you can share your comments and your own insights, your own experiences, or maybe ask a question. So thank you so far for all the comments. For those of you who've made a comment and shared some of the things that you have experienced in your own education and in your high school or primary years. So we've talked a lot about what it was like in the Victorian times. In this segment of the show, I'm going to talk about the connections between Victorian schools and schools today. And you won't be surprised about some of the connections. Koshia has already preempted some of those about rote learning and fear of making a mistake and that you'll be beaten or you'll get you be caned if you make a mistake or if you fail to remember. So rote learning was the norm in Victorian classrooms. Drill and repetition lessons were often mechanical and repetitive, as you could imagine. And so students were focused on copying and reciting. So they had physical drills and exercises, and they were used sometimes to encourage discipline. So they were reminded, they had to recite the rules probably, they had to recite their timetables or whatever tables or poems. I know that they had to learn poems by heart, they had to learn lines and all of that from texts and so on. So rote learning was really encouraged. So the question is, do we see evidence of this today? And do we see evidence of the strict discipline that I've spoken about? And I think this is probably based on subjects. But where students need to learn formulas, tables, and facts, I think some rote learning still take place and may be required. The approach, however, will differ, and it will differ from subject to subject, and it will differ from the Victorian times. Whether they're in drills, we don't do drills along with actions. In the Victorian times, they did drills along with the actions. So they had to do certain actions as well to make sure that they embed whatever it is the schools wanted to embed in their memory or leave it in their long-term memory. So although I've experienced a model of education, I must say, where students were drilled and grilled to recall grammar rules alongside some gestures to accompany the repetition, there was no punishment if the children didn't get it. But I do agree that today that there are certain things that we do expect or students to remember, and that we encourage them to remember through repetition. I think Koshi is saying that she has used this to an extent. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kosha. Oh no, you said you used to dread making a mistake. Yeah, we talked about that earlier. You used to dread making a mistake when during those drills because you knew what the punishment would be. So today we don't really punish the students if they forget, but they're expected to learn some things offhand. And I know for those of us who teach English, like contextual things and dates, we want them to remember those things. But it's not as rigid as it was in the Victorian times. In terms of strict discipline, I think it still exists, and I think it's extreme in some cases. We don't subscribe to corporal punishment, and of course, but we do other things. And I'm just going to share some of the examples of the things that I've seen, which is equivalent to punishment to an extent. Or some people may argue it's just for discipline and it's just for order. But for me, asking students to stand in the cold weather conditions, stand in line until everybody's orderly and nobody's moving, until everybody's standing orderly, there's absolute silence before they can go to form and be registered. In my opinion, and it might be controversial, I think that needs to be reviewed. Because I think there are other means of ways of ensuring that there is structure and that there's a routine without punishing our students and ourselves as teachers, standing in the cold or in the heat or whatever until the lines are perfect. Because what does it do for the students for the rest of the day? It doesn't mean that then for the rest of the day, they're orderly and well behaved and following instructions and obeying authority. So I just think some of the things we do, and those of you who are listening, you can think of some of the other stringent measures that are taken for discipline, and you yourself will question whether or not those things are relevant or effective. Detention still exists. Sending students to the head teacher to escalate an issue, that still exists today. Do we humiliate our children about their cognitive abilities? Not explicitly, in my opinion, but we do set them, and we set them according to abilities in some settings. And that is sending an implicit message that because you're not able and because you're not capable enough, you belong to that group. And we think it doesn't impact on our children, but they do go. They're sensitive enough and clever enough to figure it out, and they will ask, and they will say, "Oh, why am I in this class?" And not only do we set them, but we name them numerically. So we go set one, set two, and we go all the way down sometimes to set eight, or whichever way it's used in different schools. And so students will ask, so why am I in set eight? And then other students sometimes try to humiliate them and offend them by saying, you can't talk to me, you're in set eight. And I've seen that happen before. So although we don't put the dunce cap on and we don't humiliate them publicly, we do other things that I think could impact on a child. And I spoke about this last week when I had my lovely guests on, and we're talking about setting according to ability and my own experience in secondary school. Writing lines, I mentioned earlier, still existed when I started teaching, and I haven't seen that as a form of punishment in years. I think that's obsolete, absolute waste of time and paper and ink. Today, we will require absolute silence, as I said earlier, at some points in the lesson. But I think most teachers will agree with me that we no longer punish overtly. When students fail to comply to the silence request, we don't go, oh, get out. There are other means and ways, and we do follow the behavior policy, and it is an expectation. And as I said earlier, we rely on that death stare and that deadly look to get our students to fall in line. So, how has the role of the teacher changed since the Victorian era? And I mentioned earlier that the teachers were strict authority figures and well respected by students and the community. So, the roles of teachers have changed, in my opinion, to an extent. We are still supposed to be a figure of authority. In most instances, we are, but as I said before, that's often challenged by our students. Sometimes by parents and the wider society. In Victorian times, what the teacher said was law. Today, you're probably dragged before the head teacher for raising our voices at a student, or sometimes our marking is questioned, or knowledge and skills often belittled. So, to a large extent, the roles have changed. There's a popular saying that I've heard being bandied about: those who can't teach. And that really gets under my skin because teachers are very intelligent beings, I'll have you know, for those who subscribe to that statement. Actually, those who can teach, because we have to be experts in our subject areas. And our subject areas, they're not siloed. Often we have to draw on other subject knowledge as well in order to be excellent and to be really good in our jobs. So it takes a lot, but sometimes there's that belittling and undermining of teachers today. In Victorian times, they were seen as the most intelligent beings to exist. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Victorian schools emphasized hierarchy and obedience. The question is this in education today? And yes, hierarchy will forever remain in education, and there are titles to make them very distinct. And we do that to make sure that, there's a clear structure and that, things are done orderly and things get done and that people are made accountable for different things. So you'll always have your head teacher or principal, you've got the vice principals or deputy, and then you've got the assistant principals, which actually is relatively new because I remember it was in the early noughties where, not even the early noughties. Yes, it was early noughties where assistant principals were introduced. I remember clear as day when it was brought to my attention, oh, here's this new thing, assistant principals. So there is that hierarchy. And even amongst the staff body, there is going to be some form of hierarchy as well. And staff and students will always be reminded of who's in charge. And I remember my first year of teaching in the UK, to threaten a student who was misbehaving, you would call the head of department, or even just threaten them that you would call the head of department, and that would result in immediate compliance. Just the title. In my opinion, that has changed. You tell a child today that you're going to call the head teacher, and 9 out of 10 times, they're probably not fazed by it. They'll probably say, okay. Or they might comply, but okay, let's try not to escalate this, but not that they're doing it out of sheer obedience. It's because they probably know if it goes to the head teacher, then the parents might be notified, and then they might have an issue there. But you tell a student today, I'm going to call the head of department. They might ask you, and who's that? So for me, that has changed. Obedience is expected. We expect our children to follow the rules and to obey our instructions, but we brace ourselves sometimes for fights and arguments. And as you know, we're encouraged not to get involved in any kind of back and forth with our students because they do love a showdown, and the rest of the class, they love it. So you don't engage. So you say what you have to say, and if they're not complying, we tend to just follow the behavior policy and try to, de-escalate things. Now, the Victorians had a one-size-fits-all approach to learning, and the only differentiation they had was gendered. Boys and girls were taught separately. We still have that today to an extent. We have mixed schools, yes, but we still have our single-sex schools, and I think I did a show on that already, on single-sex schools. So that's something from the Victorian times. Boys were prepared for trade and industry, no surprises there, and girls' domestic skills. So for a long time, I think boys excelled in those STEM subjects. And I think there's been a shift in mindset and where STEM subjects are now promoted among girls. And I remember there was a big drive to get our girls more involved. So lots of resources have been thrown to shift those mindsets and to provide for a more inclusive education. Today, we have more personalized, tailored learning to suit the needs of our students. Back then, it was one size fits all. So if you had any needs, SEND needs, or any learning difficulties, then unfortunately, there was no provision for you. So that has changed significantly. So before we go to the news, let's talk about how the Industrial Revolution shaped Victorian education. So I mentioned that earlier. But how does our digital revolution compare in terms of impact? And I'm sure you'll agree that the digital age is definitely shaping education today. We've got the AI influence. I know some schools are saying they're going to ban the use of ChatGPT, although I think it has its place. But we see the influence of that. And especially for us English teachers, that's a challenge for coursework. We see how the digital age is shaping jobs and the workforce. That's changing as well. And we clearly need to equip our students so that they can function successfully in this new environment. We see accessibility to information, no longer having to rely on the teacher for information. Whilst you're teaching, students could be checking you whilst you're teaching. They're quietly Googling and just checking if what Miss said or what Sir said is accurate. We have more distractions in this digital age as well. Teachers and educators will therefore have to adjust pedagogical approaches to incorporate emerging technologies. And so just as how the Industrial Revolution shaped education, I think the digital age is doing just that, where we have to rethink some of our approaches to teaching and learning, where we have to think about the workforce, the demands of our society, and then try to meet those demands. So before we go for the news, just think about it whilst we listen to the news tonight. Just think about it. To what extent are we still carrying on some of those Victorian values? Have we shifted significantly, or the remnants that exist, do they really help to shape what education is like today? Do stay tuned. Those of you who've joined and you are still listening to me on my own tonight, thank you so much. I would love to hear from you. If you've experienced any of these Victorian style teaching or approaches to discipline in your school setting, do stay tuned. Let's join the news.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
In this week's education news, The Guardian, The Standard, and several other newspapers report that the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, pledges to tackle chronic skills shortages by abolishing the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education and replacing it with a new body called Skills England. The bill, which will transfer the functions of the Apprenticeships and Technical Education Institute, reached its second reading in the House of Commons and was passed by 317 votes to 55. In support of the bill, Phillipson said, "The skills gaps that we face in our country deny people the opportunity, the power and the freedom to choose the life that they want to live." Critics of the bill argued that the new body, Skills England, will not be truly independent and will not have the respect of the profession. Phillipson responded by saying this approach was necessary because of the urgency of the skills shortage. Periodical Schools Week carries the story of ex-schools inspectors who have launched the Alternative Big Consultation on Ofsted report cards. Former senior officials behind the Alternative Big Listen last year fear that current proposals to change the inspection system are being presented as take it or leave it. Frank Norris and Colin Richards have therefore created the Alternative Big Consultation to independently gather opinions on plans for new report cards. The survey, which launched this week and closes on April the 4th, will run alongside Ofsted's own official 12-week consultation, which closes on April the 28th. The Alternative Big Consultation comprises the same questions as the government's own consultation on the plans, but also asks respondents if they believe the proposals are fit for purpose. Many teachers and school leaders have expressed their view on the proposed report card model that it's hardly an improvement and contains many of the weaknesses of the previous system. Also in the news this week, the Daily Express covered a story with the title, "Save Our School Playtime." It went on to explain that experts warn of dire consequences as the break times in schools are cut. A report by the Raising the Nation Play Commission found outdoor playtime at school is being squeezed out of children's lives and must be restored. The Guardian carried a story under the headline, "Ministers urged to add audio books to England's new schools curriculum." A poll by the National Literacy Trust found that children's enjoyment of listening to audio and podcasts had risen compared to the previous year, overtaking their enjoyment of reading for the first time since the charity began asking about audio in 2020. The charity said it was therefore advocating for increased access to and a broadening of the variety of reading formats available to pupils, to include audio. Jonathan Douglas of the NLT stated, "In recent years, we've seen a steady rise in children's enjoyment of listening to audio and uncovered the myriad benefits it can bring, from sparking a love of reading to deepening learning and boosting well-being." PES Magazine reported this week that primary school PE training was woefully inadequate. As reported to MPs, the chief executive of Youth Sport Trust called for PE to become a core subject to drive up standards and improve fitness. Giving evidence to the Commons Culture, Media and Sport Committee, Ali Oliver called for PE to become a core curriculum subject with much higher status, and she told the committee that training problems were exacerbating the situation where there were 41,000 fewer hours in 2020-23 compared to 2011 and 12. Less than half of children are getting what the chief medical officer recommends as the minimum amount of activity. More worryingly, we know that 30% of children get less than 30 active minutes a day. LBC News reported that a teacher was sacked after a joke about whacking a pupil over the head was misunderstood. Lakshmi Subrian, who had taught for over 35 years, was sacked after a school child who spoke English as a second language misunderstood the comment. The teacher was dismissed from Gilbert Colvin Primary School in Ilford, East London in 2023 following the incident. Miss Subrian took the school to an employment tribunal, claiming the remark had been made in jest while teaching Year 6 pupils and preparing them for their maths SAT exam. Speaking at the disciplinary hearing in July 2023, she said the child's decision to continue attending her after-school club showed they had not been that upset. However, she lost the appeal. Teachers' unions supporting Miss Subrian argue that this case adds to the vulnerability many teachers feel when a single ill-judged remark could end a career. And finally, a piece of research by the British Educational Research Association. Like many pieces of research, it shows something we might have always suspected was true. In their paper, A Century of Educating Britain's Political Elite, Privilege Masquerading as Meritocracy, they show how Oxbridge and private schools, called in Britain public schools, dominate the selection of cabinet ministers and prime ministers. Oxbridge educated 14 of 21 prime ministers between 1922 and 2022. Unsurprisingly, they conclude that the concentration of elite formation systems raises concerns that their graduates will suffer from groupthink. Analysing a series of important decisions made across the 20th century, it seems certain attitudes, such as the necessity to accept neoliberalist economics, the importance of Britain as a world power, and above all, the acceptance of class privilege itself, go unchallenged. Well, there's a surprise. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News, brought to you by John Gibbs.
Thank you, John. Oh, wow. That was a very, very interesting news brief. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for staying with me tonight. I appreciate that. Thanks for the comments so far. Thank you, Kosha, for participating so actively. Charlie, lovely to see that you're online, and I hope you're enjoying the show. I would love to hear your experience as a student as well, and if you experienced anything similar to what the Victorians experienced when you were in school. Not as extreme, but maybe in terms of teaching and learning. So thank you all so much, and this is the final segment of the show. So far, we've talked about Victorian education. We've looked at it from a historical perspective and its evolution. How it shaped education. We've looked at some of the rules. We've looked at approaches to teaching and learning. We looked at their forms of punishment and the role of the teacher in the classroom. And we've also then kind of looked at that as it relates to the 21st century and how it's helped to influence some of the things that we still carry out today and how it differs. So for this final segment, we'll continue with that. But I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things from the news, which relates to tonight's show. And John talked about audiobooks, and that research has shown that more children increasingly are listening to audiobooks rather than reading them. And, that links back to the point that was made just before the news about the impact of the digital age. And that is one of the impacts. And so that's why I was saying it's so important that as educators, we try not to shy away from this evolution in technology and the advancement of technology. We have to keep up with the trends so that we can make ourselves relevant and we can assist our young people. Now, he also mentioned skills shortages and that a bill is being passed to address that. And my question is, why is this an issue? Is it because for years we've placed more emphasis on the more academic subjects, So that's something to think about. And now we're seeing the impact of that in today's society where there's a shortage because, we're so driven by the academics and students must get these subjects and their progress 8 and attainment this and so on. And we push all our students to everybody must go to university. I disagree with that. And I don't think everybody needs to go to university to be successful. There are different paths, and we should really encourage our young people to follow the path that that they want and that will really help them to be fulfilled human beings in the end and wholesome human beings. And everybody does not have to go down the strict academic route. And maybe that's why we're beginning to see this skills shortage. And then that other item about the teacher in jest saying something about whacking a student over the head after being in the classroom for so long, now being asked to step down. And that's another thing as well. I talked about it earlier in the Victorian times. It would not just be a threat, it would actually be an action. They would have been whacked across the leg, the bottom, wherever. That would not have been reported. It would have been no repercussions. And I'm not condoning that at all. I'm just trying to show you how things have moved along, because now that was just banter, so to speak, or the teacher said it in jest, but it was taken seriously. So in today's classroom, we have to be so careful. We have to be so careful about the things that we say and the things that we say in jest, because not all the students will see it as such. So it's so important. So that already, that sums up and shows you how far we've come and how things have changed from the Victorian times. So another question I'm going to explore are school uniforms, standardized tests, and rigid curricula remnants of the Victorian systems. Most definitely. All of those are stemming from that period, but each can be justified, and these are purely my opinions. Now, in terms of uniforms, I think it provides a leveling playing field, and it helps with discipline as well. I hope I'm not being contradictory, but asking our students to wear their uniform and to look a certain way, I think it helps them later on in life when they turn up for job interviews or in the workplace, how they carry themselves. But then again, not everybody works in environments where they have to be smartly attired in a suit every day, or a tie, or shirts tucked in. So that's something to think about. But I think uniforms remove the class system, because you wear your uniform, it doesn't really identify your class. Whereas if you wear your own clothes, it would be easy to determine who can afford it and who can't. Now, in my current setting, students wear uniform and there's a strict uniform policy, and most of our students adhere to that. And I could just imagine it if they'd remove that. Oh my goodness, the brands that you would see coming into school. A colleague of mine took a photograph of a pair of trainers, one of the top brand trainers, which I will not name on this platform, just left there after school, casually, clearly forgotten. And she took a picture of it because, like, oh my gosh, look at this. And I'm sure the next day you're going to find it in Lost and Found. And at the end of the term, you'll find it again in Lost and Found. So I think what the uniforms do, they try to make sure that everybody looks the same and you can't really distinguish who is who based on that. But then we could argue that that removes individuality. And when you force students to wear a uniform and everybody's looking the same, then where is that expression of self? Others say it reduces instances of bullying. I'm not sure if there's a study that has proven that, because I think children will bully regardless. They will find something to bully other students about. So I'm not so sure uniform helps with that. In terms of standardized tests, controversial, but also used to break down social barriers and give everyone a fair chance. So we use these tests to get students to the next level. So your external exams and all of that. However, it can be argued that those who cannot afford tuition may sometimes be left behind. And we know that it's the middle class parents who are able to provide the extra tuition for students so that they can excel. Quite frankly, somebody may argue, why do they need tuition? Everything should be done in the classroom. But I guess there are some students who need that one-to-one, and not everybody could afford that. I mentioned this in another forum, talking about parents paying for children to do extra lessons with things like the 11 plus. So standardized tests, still a thing, but it's hopefully gives everybody a fair chance. That's something for discussion. With regards to the rigid curricula, I think there's more flexibility today because we have a range of options. Remember in the Victorian times, it was the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. But now we have more options, and we've got BTEC subjects as well. And we've got the languages, not just for a certain class, but everybody could take French and Spanish, and other languages as well are being offered in the curriculum today. So we do have, to an extent, there is some rigidity because you still have to do core subjects. On the news, apparently, as John said, they're hoping to introduce PE as a core subject. So happy I'm no longer at school because, sorry, PE teachers, I love you all, but it wasn't my favorite thing. So that I would have struggled with that. But we still have the core, the maths, the English, and sciences. So we still have that rigid structure there where the students are expected to do those 3 subjects. However, there are other options. So not as rigid as our Victorian counterparts. So another question is, if a Victorian headmaster walked in, or headmistress, by the way, walked into a school today, what would they recognize and what would shock them? And I just noted a few things. I would say, one, immediately they would recognize the uniforms. They would recognize that we're still asking girls to tie their hairs back and the boys' hair to be cut a certain way as well. They would recognize that some desks are still in rows. And even though we encourage students to sit in groups today, when a class is extremely difficult, I've seen where teachers would put the desks back in rows until that class gets in line, until that class conforms. So if they're becoming too chatty, right, put you back in rows. So you will find that to an extent today. We still have the hierarchy we've got. And I mean, in any society, you have that. That's not going to change. And the school is a reflection of our society. So you will have your leaders and you will have those who are meant to follow. If you can think of anything else that they would see and recognize, please leave a comment. What would shock a Victorian head teacher today? I think the lack of discipline. They would be shocked to see a student answering back a teacher. They would be shocked to see a student not following instructions first time around. They would be shocked probably to see students leaving their seats without permission to just do random things like just go to the bin to put a tiny bit of paper in, or just leave their seats to go and get a pen off somebody without asking. So they'd probably be shocked about those things. Shocked at the number of students who end up in detention. Shocked at the punctuality crisis. The attendance crisis is still a thing. They'll probably be shocked at that. And maybe the lack of Latin. Why isn't Latin being taught? They would be puzzled, like, what's going on? And I'm sure there are some settings where Latin is still being taught today, but it's not as popular as it was back then. So maybe some of the things that they would be shocked about. I think also maybe teachers as well, and how we carry ourselves today, maybe not as formal as they did back then. They would be shocked also that we come with our lessons pre-planned and we don't really write on the board of such because we've got our PowerPoints ready for learning. They'll probably be shocked at the fact that there's not much rote learning, although there is. And I think there's a new drive to encourage that to an extent. They will be shocked at the fact that our children probably still don't know their times table offhand, and they sometimes resort to counting the fingers. That they can't recite poems or Shakespeare. I don't know. Some of the things that they might be shocked about. Or they might be shocked that children can write in exercise books and have stuff to go back to and learn rather than depending on rote learning. Because remember back then, they used slates. And so you had to clean your slate for the next lesson. and then they introduced the quill pens. You dipped it in the ink and you would write. So prior to that, nothing was there for you to look back on. So you had to retain all the information. And so many of us would struggle today. We can barely remember our phone numbers or the phone numbers of our family members today, much less. So those are some of the things that would shock them. So what is the future of education? I think with the rise of technology, student-centered learning, and global accessibility, we're steadily breaking free from some of the remnants of Victorian education. And that goes without saying. And I think the gap is just going to continue to widen until lots of things will be almost non-existent. Well, I'm not so sure about testing and all of that in uniforms. Maybe those are here to stay. Who knows? So while some practices might be considered as outdated, like standardized testing, rigid curricula, and factory-style schooling, it's like a conveyor belt. We train this group of kids, we unleash them onto the world, and we get another batch in, and we do the same. Regardless of that, we know that education is undergoing a profound transformation from the Victorian era constraints. And moving forward, an educational system that is more flexible, more inclusive, and future oriented. So I think it's okay to sum up that, yes, there are still some remnants of the Victorian education system in terms of our infrastructure and some of our approaches to learning and the way we structure our schools, and even the very way we structure the school day is a remnant of the Victorian era. The only difference is I think schools went up until sometimes 5 p.m., where that's slightly different today, unless we have some kind of meeting or training after school, but it's not a requirement of such today. So we still have some of the infrastructure, but we know that we're more flexible today and, as I said, more inclusive and moving away from this rigid thing. We try to cater to the needs of our students more. We have smaller class sizes. The Victorian times, as I said earlier, up to 100. So that has changed significantly. I think our teachers are more prepared. The training is more comprehensive as well. And so our students get a lot more out of us. There's more room for independent learning. We try to encourage critical thinking, although ultimately critical thinking comes right back to what we want them to know. And our children talk about that as well. They will say, you ask a question, miss, we give you our opinion, but then you still keep asking because you have a particular answer in mind. So yes, so there are still some things, okay, that we've taken from that era. And for me, it's the silence. If you're going to be working quietly or independently, I want that to be done in absolute silence. But there are moments where we need to have a buzz in the classroom and we need to have our students having a discussion, and we need to encourage them to challenge us as well and to question things and not to get angry about it, but to listen to our students, to make them understand that we are infallible. So as we move further away from the Victorian system and embrace the new digital age, let us continue to do so as professionals. Let us continue to do so, bearing in mind that the children in our care, they are the primary focus when we walk into that classroom. Their well-being, their academic achievement, and their goals and aspirations, that we provide everything that they need to meet those goals and aspirations. So that is the end of tonight's show. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining in with the comments. And please encourage your friends and family in the future to download the Podbean app to join in. Also to download the podcast, which will be made available shortly after the program. And thank you so much. Hopefully next fortnight, I will be talking about inclusive education. So just kind of building on what we talked about tonight. Thank you so much for joining, wherever you're joining from. And do continue to tune in to the Wednesday Twilight Show.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.